Hello, and welcome to our lecture today. I want to spend some time today, now that we've had an introduction to the class and have really seen an example of historical analysis in action with the example of Ruth Feldstein's article that we discussed last week. I want to really dive into a particular type of historical analysis, which is the Duboisian method. I'm not going to spend so much time today explaining the biography of W.E.B. Du Bois, although I will have some more of that specifically next week. But I do want to help you unpack some of what is meant by the Du Boisian method, both sort of across social sciences as well as historically. So this is what you'll see right now when you go in your classroom, and I want to provide you with my intention here. I'm going to keep Module 3 open another week. And we're going to add to what we're talking about with Du Bois a little bit more in depth with an assignment next week. So pay attention. We're going to stay here in Module 3 for a bit longer than a week. We're going to stay here for 2 weeks because I really want us to take considerable time for you to, if you have never read some specific parts of Black Reconstruction in America, because it really sets up a interesting historical analysis and a methodology of that analysis that is a great example of how you take statistics and qualitative sociological data and use it historically. So we are going to spend some time with that today. And I just want to first, show you a couple of things about the discussion. So I have an article right here for you all to read. And then when you click on the PDF of Black Reconstruction, I have a free copy for you here. Now, it is free, which is great. The problem is it doesn't have any, it doesn't have an introduction. Doesn't have a table of contents, doesn't tell you when any of this is published. So if you go on Amazon's website, you can open up the book. And I recommend you doing this just so you don't need to buy it, just so you can look at the cover publications for a couple of reasons. So the full title, of course, is Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, right? And if we take a look into the book, right, the first thing that should sort of strike you is the first printing of this book is 1935. So, what's happening in 1935? Well, certainly it is Jim Crow America, and also in the midst of the Great Depression, as well as, right, a sort of communist movement amongst workers and intellectuals embracing another type of system, perhaps communism, perhaps socialism, in the midst of what seemed to be the collapse and sort of death knell of capitalism. So keep that in mind. I think it's interesting, right, that 30 years later there's another printing right before Du Bois, or he dies in either 62 or 63, forgive me. I can't remember. But right at the end of his life, and also at the beginning of a sort of another articulation of sort of Pan-African awareness that is linked to Ghana and other African nations becoming independent from European rule. It'll take another 30 years for another printing of this, right? So what's happening in the 1990s is a new type of historical scholarship, particularly American historical scholarship, is being created. One that is much more race conscious, much more labor conscious, much more class conscious than it had been in the 70s and 80s. So just by looking at this alone, right, I hope you're starting to see the magnitude of what this work is going to mean. Um, it is both an articulation of its own context as well as examples of economic and social scholarship. So if you're thinking of what are the lenses that Du Bois is looking through, certainly it is economics, and we'll be able to know that by the words he selects, right? So a good historian, a good scholar of history, rather, can take a work and begin to unpack the author's perspective. You should be able to do the same. So if we look at some of the contents, like we have the introduction, we have how the book is organized. So there's the black worker, the white worker, the planter, the general strike, coming of the Lord, looking back, looking forward, the transubstantiation of a poor white, disaster, black proletariat in South Carolina, the black proletariat in Mississippi, the white proletariat in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, the duel for land control. Why am I making all of this so pointed? Well, typically when you see historical texts using the terminology, right, of worker, strike, proletariat, this is all very Marxist language. So we can already deduce before we read any word that Du Bois is writing that he is very class conscious, right? And we know this. We don't have to be an expert in Marxism to know this. Proletariat, workers, strikes. So just by pulling out the language here, we can already, again, really start to see the lenses that Du Bois is going to look at. And then let's, again, inspect this a little bit more. What else strikes you about this? Well, the transubstantiation, right? The coming of the Lord. That's very religious as well. So many of these sort of undercurrents that we know are influencing Du Bois and that he's writing about in other works, we see articulated here as well. So when we take a deep dive into this work, which is what you will be able to do here, he is writing this magnificent retelling of the United States in the midst of a economic crisis. So the emphasis on workers, right? Specifically what workers can do is of great historical interest to Du Bois. And he's also going to really use the idea, and here we see it again, right, of the great strike, of what he shows us by this rich history of detail, and I'm going to get to that, this rich use of detail, and I'm going to get to that in just a second, is that he is going to make the argument that enslaved populations across the American South are engaged in a general strike of their labor that is going on, that is also self-liberating. So one of the central nuggets here to take from Du Bois, and again, just by looking at the titles of the chapters, is that this general strike of enslaved populations in the South are self-liberating. You can also start to unpack the difference in narrative between self-liberation, right, and liberation from above, liberation from Lincoln, liberation in terms of the amendments, 13, 14, 15 specifically. Du Bois is putting forth the assertion in 1936 that those who are enslaved are self-liberators. And that is done because of the workers and the strength of workers demanding compensation for their labor, demanding to control their own means of production. Again, borrowing that language and that Marxist perspective. But he adds to that, if it were just a Marxist perspective, it wouldn't be Duboisian. What makes it Duboisian is, of course, the race consciousness that he is also putting forth. So if, say, as Karl Marx is writing about the exploitation of British workers, right? What Marx is not writing about is any sort of racial component to that exploitation. And he's not really doing a deep dive in it, even within his own lifetime. Here, W.E.B. Du Bois is very much, right, just as interested in the race consciousness of Black Reconstruction as he is with the worker exploitation aspect. That's why you have to sort of take those two things together. Now, I want to show you this. I just posted this into your classroom. Oh, whoops, sorry. And it's a little insight, again, into the practice of the Duboisian method. And I have uploaded a number of photos that I took from an exhibit on Duboisian, the Duboisian method that was featured at the Apex Museum of African American History on Auburn Avenue about 2 years ago. And although I didn't move it over correctly, take some time and start to look at exactly what this evidence is. This is a collection of the types of data, surveys, statistics, information that Du Bois has gathered about the Black populations of which he's studying. Most of this is being done in Atlanta. Some of this is being done in other counties in Georgia. But that is what he's collecting in this here. So he's also looking at family budgets. He's going to look at areas, right, of population, where those populations are distributed, right? He's going to also look at, that's a copy, I apologize, mortality rates in terms of the broader United States. And of course, here he's looking at the city of Philadelphia. This is a collection of the exhibit in Paris that many of you are aware of. But this is what I want to sort of bring your focus to. And another example of this Duboisian method of evidence collecting. So here we have percentages, right? And he's going to break it down for us here in terms of amount of money and then the actual averages and income. And he's looking at how do 150 Negro Black families in Atlanta, how do they spend their money? And what do they spend their money on? So we have all of this rich evidence and data to extrapolate. And what you start to walk away from is that those who are, right, again, Black Atlantans at basically the turn of the century, there's only a small amount of this population that is considered poor, right? You have 9.9% here. You have what looks like 4% here, right? Keep going with that. This means that the majority of the population, right, is well-to-do and comfortable. So this is very interesting. This gives us, again, a couple of things to really sort of marinate on. One is what we think we know about the time period. Two is what the evidence tells us about the time period. And others, what happens when we use a lot of rich statistical evidence in order to build a historical perspective. So I think you can absolutely take more time and really look at this, right? And we can start to understand, what people are spending their money on in terms of rent, in terms of food, in terms of taxes, and then all of these sort of other expenses and savings. So what we have in Atlanta at the turn of the century really is this expansive, well-to-do wealthy African American middle and upper class that is really driving. Um, that is disrupted, of course, by the 1906 Atlanta massacre. That then, just as in Tulsa, and of course, this happens a decade before, but just as in Tulsa, that wealth is taken. So we really can see a real application of what this um, Duboisian method, what it looks like in practice. And I will try to get these turned around. But again, it's not only right um, the collection of sociological data, but then how that sociological data is used to demonstrate its impact on race, its impact on the Black family. And then in Black Reconstruction, again, coming back to this, um, he's bringing that sociological eye, if you will, um, to this massive topic of Reconstruction. So I hope that is helpful to us as you begin to read the text itself. Like I said, Du Bois can at times be a bit difficult to digest. I'm going to spend some time next week really talking about some the specific Du Boisian language to identify not only in terms of the proletariat exploitation, but also terms like double consciousness, the veil. Um, Many of you certainly have a vast exposure to the terminology, but it's also important to remember and sort of refresh your knowledge as you read and engage with the text itself. So we will continue our conversation of Du Bois, and I will also add a very quick recap of Karl Marx, just so you can differentiate the two. But again, you cannot have discussions of Du Bois without race consciousness, as he's really um, creating this academic space with other scholars. Um, but again, think about the time period of which he's writing and how the implications that must have had for him um, at the time. All right, thank you very much. Let me know what questions you have.